Welcome to the Business of Story podcast, where the world's best storytellers from business, Hollywood, and beyond teach you how to use stories to communicate and connect with your customers. The Business of Story is sponsored by ACT, the best-selling customer management software for small business, Oracle Marketing Cloud, enabling businesses to target, engage, convert, analyze, and use marketing technology to deliver a better customer experience. Sixter, allowing marketers to automatically inject clickable images called campaigns into every one of their employee email signatures to promote their company's most important initiatives or content. And by Signal Labs, the real-time cross-media story tracking platform. Here's your host, Park Howell from Park & Co. and today's special Business of Story guest.
Hello, everyone. I'm Park Howell, and welcome to another edition of Business of Story. My job here is to connect you with the top storytelling minds in business who share tips and techniques to drive growth for your professional services firm through, you guessed it, the power of story. That's what we do here. And you know what? We would love to do it with you. We're available for story strategy consulting for your brand, webinars and workshops for your people, and speaking engagements for your gatherings. Our goal, either through this podcast or working with you one-on-one, is to reignite your one true superpower, storytelling, so you can nudge the world in any direction you choose. Learn more about Business of Story at businessofstory.com, where we have a utility belt of storytelling tools for you to download, all to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. Now today, I have a real character in the Business of Story studios. She's a journalist for the Arizona Republic, a Gannett newspaper, a very gifted story developer, and mastermind behind the Arizona Storytellers Project, which has now inspired storytelling projects across the country. Our own Arizonan, Megan Finnerty. Now, in today's show, Megan shares with us how storytelling is very much like cooking and the 5 P's that make up the ingredients for every great story. And finally, a recipe of the do's and don'ts in your storytelling, like don't brag and, well, keep sex out of it, if you will. You'll love her energy, her wit, her wisdom. So let's let the stories begin. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's awesome to have you on Business of Story. We got a chance to get acquainted a few months ago. Went to one of your Arizona Storytelling Project workshops, and you have been doing amazing work with this, and now it's inspired this national movement around storytelling. But before we get to that, how did you find yourself, you're a journalist at the Arizona Republic, how did you find yourself all of a sudden heading up storytelling projects?
Well, like all good ideas, I stole mine. I love the Moth podcast, MOTH, and it's a national storytelling thing out of Brooklyn. They do open mic, well, they're kind of open mic, but they do nights where people come up, they tell a story for 5 minutes, they get yanked off the stage at 6, and you have to put your name in a hat and all this other stuff. And I liked it. I would listen to the podcast on my phone because it wasn't carried in Phoenix at the time, and I thought, well, what's behind that? How are they really doing it? And so I did a little homework, and I actually approached them and said, could we do that here in Phoenix? And they were like, yeah, it costs this much money to bring us out. And I was like, obviously I work for a media, we have no money. But then they sent me the pitch, so I saw what the pieces were. And I was like, we have all those pieces. Like, I work in a newsroom, so I have promotion. I could be my own MC. Why? Because I told a good toast at my sister's wedding one time, and I was drunk on the power of it. Yeah, right. So, I kind of and then we already had a partnership with South Mountain Community College. We had done a series of stories called Arizona Storytellers, and they were on the front page. They were print stories. And it was headed up by one of my editors named Kira. And the whole thing was we wanted to tell stories of regular, everyday Arizonans on the front page to celebrate 100 years of our state. Because we felt like, normally the front page is dominated by criminals and politicians and no, I'm kidding. Right. And so instead they said, to celebrate our state, regular people though, or who makes Arizona wild and wonderful and compelling. Mm-hmm. And Kira had this great idea to put those on video. And so they partnered with people at South Mountain Community College to help get people able to tell their own story in a compelling way. It went well. People showed up. We made a bunch of videos that way. I just thought, well, the Moth is doing this in bars and cool restaurants, and I have no reason to believe we couldn't do that in Phoenix. So I sort of took the relationships and the basic the sort of like underlying concept from what the Republic had already developed. And then I took the other parts from the Moth and I put them together. And now, that's kind of what it looks like.
We just had a Moth master on our show, Margot Lightman.
Oh,
she
awesome.
came out with a new book called Long Story Short, hysterical book, but all about helping to ignite that inner storyteller. So it's really neat to have this program in town. And was it meant to be sort of a short-lived thing that kind of found its legs and has just taken off? Because it's amazing.
Thanks. We've done more than 75 shows in the last 4.5 years with almost 500 people who've told live, true stories told live by everyday people. And when it started, I booked 3 in a row because I kind of said to my bosses, well, there's no point doing a one-off because then you don't really know what you have. Like if you're going to launch something, launch it. Because, it's Phoenix. Oh my gosh, what if it rained? No one would come. And I have 5 people there. And everyone would be like, oh, you had a terrible idea. And I'd be like, no, it rained. Like no one gets in their car in Phoenix when it rains. So we did 3 to start and I booked them in June, July, and August because I knew restaurants were empty. And I said, give me your Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, when literally you're just dying to get people in restaurants, basically. And they went really well. And my bosses were, of course, like, well, maybe you could do them quarterly. Like, don't kill yourself because you have another job. And I did. My job was to continue doing everything I already did at the paper, not lose any money, and not embarrass my newsroom.
Well, let's talk about that out of the job. You worked for Gannett, Arizona Republic.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what you do for a living in addition to all this work.
So at the time, I was the nightlife and features editor. I still wrote stories here and there, but I was responsible for editing maybe 35 stories a week. And I managed a staff of like 3 reporters and 2 interns, and I had a freelance budget and blah, blah, blah. So my job was to make sure that everything was covered from cocktail competitions to St. Patrick's Day to like 10 great places for mojitos to, making sure that the Prada del Sol is previewed appropriately in the Scottsdale Republic.
Which is a big parade here in Scottsdale. Yeah,
historic Western style parade around the New Year. And so all of that, like soup to nuts, anything that was sort of fun to do would be my job. Somebody else handled primary arts coverage, but like that kind of thing was my job to manage all that coverage. And so Storytellers was sort of a natural side project. I was like, oh, it's an event. We are throwing our own event. And I was the MC. So everything developed really organically, sort of like how we do the training, yada, yada. And as it developed, I sort of was compelled by my management structure to formalize a lot of the processes because I do work for a big corporation and my newsroom is really large and we are kind of a formal place, like we have a newsroom of more than 250 people. So you can't it started definitely as like me doing my own thing. But you can't scale up. You can't really achieve a lot of things if it's just like, oh, Megan's little project in the corner. And I'm also always using the resources and the name of a giant company. So I really couldn't ever act like it was just me out there. It was always me as an ambassador for the Arizona Republic and of the brand we'd already built. So I sort of from the start had to bake in certain aspects of professionalism and best practices that I think other people who just follow their heart or do passion projects, they actually aren't compelled to do that so early in the process. It does get to be way more organic. So that was kind of a real benefit to being part of a giant corporate machine is you're compelled to sort of do some paperwork on the front end that really helps you grow on the back end.
Well, and it seems as we have gotten to know each other and I read more about you online, that your background goes well beyond just writing for a newspaper. You are truly a story developer across many platforms. And you talk about experiential storytelling, which is way more interesting to millennials, Gen Xers, and whatever. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what do you mean when you talk about cross-platform storytelling?
Oh, yeah. So as a regular reporter, I've always written feature stories, basically. Like I've written about everything from dark skies preservation here in Arizona to one of my all-time favorite stories was I wrote about loneliness on Valentine's Day and what it's like to go out and get all dressed up and then go to Jack in the Box by yourself at 2:30 in the morning because no one asked you to dance, basically. I have also profiled Amanda Blackhorse, who's a Navajo woman who's taking on the Redskins football team and fighting them at the national level. So I've really, soup to nuts. I've also, written up a million stories about where to get the best cocktails in Phoenix. So, from a print and online readership standpoint, that was always what I did. But I have this sort of fairly large personality and I'm like a pretty competent public speaker. So when So I launched, this is a true story, a million years ago, I launched a cocktail competition because I became the nightlife editor at the paper and I wanted people to know the Arizona Republic covered cocktails seriously. Well,
Wait a minute, covered cocktails seriously? Okay,
yes, because
good.
cocktails, at the end of the day, cocktails are just a business. These are all business stories, really. But, they dressed up as sexy, fun stories. So I called Local First. They were doing already the Devoured competition, which is a food event. And I contacted them, and they're an Arizona-based nonprofit that encourages people to spend their money locally because $1 spent keeps 48 cents in the state, all that. And I said, oh, hey, the Arizona Republic or AZ Central wants to launch a cocktail competition to draw attention to its cocktail coverage. Would you guys help me out with that and sort of like partner, quote unquote? No, I had no reason to do, like no one, I barely even told my bosses I was doing this.
Right.
I borrowed a PA system. I called a bar. They said, yeah, you can use the patio. And none of these people were my friends, but they were people who knew me at the paper. And I was able to leverage my professional relationship. And I said, we'll write a story about it. So you'll get free coverage. We'll bring people in. And then Local First helped by saying, we have relationships. We can secure the vodka, basically. Like, we'll secure the spirits. I asked people I knew to be the judges. I mean, it was really built on the relationships and the Rolodex I had as a professional journalist to say, let's do this thing. Well, now Local First took it over because they're amazing. I still MC it, but it's going on 7 years, and I think more than 400 people came to the last one.
And Local First, to be clear, is a local organization that promotes local businesses over the franchises.
Yeah, they're a nonprofit. Yeah. They're non-political. They're nonpartisan. My newsroom writes about them in a variety of capacities, and we felt like they were the right kind of partnership because they're just sort of pro-Arizona business.
They do amazing work.
They do. Yeah. They're really good. And so that's also something, I've always built in is lots of people want to partner with us, but I'm still always bringing my whole newsroom to the table. So we have to be very selective about being nonpartisan, non-controversial, never partnering with someone that would become a problem later on for any of my other colleagues. I don't even know. The VA wanted to partner with us, and that's not a decision I can make by myself. Yeah. Yeah. Because, we cover the VA and there's a lot of bad stuff going on there. There's a lot of great stuff. They're also an arm of the federal government. That's fine. But I can't make that kind of decision in a vacuum. So anyway, there's just all these considerations.
And you won a National Headliner Award for Journalistic Innovation?
Yeah.
So because of what you've done with storytelling?
Yeah, journalists are always looking to give each other awards, and they're always but they're always also looking for the next thing that's going to make us relevant to our audiences. Right. And one of so we always talk about what's our value proposition, because you might be thinking, well, this girl just ripped off The Moth, and I'd be like, well, yeah, there are no good new ideas. Let's be honest, The Moth also ripped off a guy on his home porch. That's how that started, right? Let's not kid ourselves here. But what we feel like we bring to the table and what's sort of been recognized by journalism organizations, and it's our value proposition. This is what we go to sponsors with, is we say that journalism and oral storytelling can serve the same best, or can serve the same values, or have the same values. Sorry, I'm not being very together. Journalism and oral storytelling have the same values. And those are to lift up and serve the community in which they are and to develop empathy among those people. And that is not something I wrote the first week I launched this. It's not something I wrote the second year I launched this. But it is stuff I noodled around. And after the first year, I was writing about it a lot, and I was able to sort of really more deeply articulate what are we doing? It started off, and I always joke about this, as just a way to get strangers to listen to me talk about my feelings in public. And it's worked amazingly.
Perfect.
Right?
I've seen you in action, and you freely share, that's for certain.
And in the first year, I told a lot because I was modeling behavior in the community. And I was also trying to show people, hey, I'm putting myself out there. I'm asking you to do the same thing, but look at all this skin I got in the game. I got a ton of skin in this game. Well, now everyone wants to do it. I think I've told twice this year. And I'm actually telling now on other people's shows, because I don't tell on my own nights anymore. I just don't. I have too many people. I want to give other people the opportunity. I also don't MC by myself anymore. I've had to bring in co-MCs. And that's not just about my time, but it's also about broadening the identities of the people you see on stage. You guys can't see me, but I'm a middle-class white girl who's Irish Catholic and from Northwest Indiana. And I'm 35, so I look like those things. I would like to think I look better than 35. I wear a lot of sunblock. But So I'm trying to bring in people who are not my ethnicity, are not my age, are not my gender to be my co-MCs, because then hopefully more people will see someone like themselves on the stage, and then they will feel more invited to participate. So, I'm always doing all this math about how do we message inclusivity? How do we message community? And I'm really, really churched up. I'm really, really clear with people about this is run by a newsroom, and it has newsroom values. And those values are pro-social fundamentally. Like, no one can get up there and tell a story about, like, there's no point in living. They can tell a story about the time they felt like there was no point in living. And they could spend a lot of time talking about how terrible it was. But they do kind of need to finish with, like, here's the turning point and here's a tiny glimmer. And even at Christmas, though, I did have a guy tell a story about, like, how there is no God, and there is no Santa, and sometimes your family will fail you at the holidays. But the end of his story was sort of like, but here's how, like, I got through that with my, like, basically the love of my partner in my life and blah, blah, blah. So I'm not saying that all the stories have to be positive or happy, but they do need to be fundamentally pro-social. They also have to be kind of PG-13. People are always like, you should do an after-hour show. And I was like, well, that's not really in the brand of a mass market community newsroom. There are lots of other venues that can sponsor storytelling nights that have a different reputation or a different identity, and that's appropriate for them. So kind of a lot of the ways we make our decisions is it always comes back to, like, newsroom values, which we are really clear on. We've been in newsroom for 125 years, which is crazy. So that's also some of the ways I think we've been able to be successful, is that, like, I've always been super clear about the identity of the people we were serving, which is the greater Phoenix market, and of who we are, which is our journalists who want to make our city a more connected and livable place.
So, Megan, we need to take a break here to throw to some of our great sponsors of Business' Story podcast. And when we come back, can you tell us one of your very favorite stories that you've shared throughout the years about you? And then I would also like to talk about what have you learned in this process about the basic fundamentals of storytelling that our listeners can use in their own lives, knowing that a lot of our listeners are in B2B companies, professional services firms, and we're always trying to humanize those brands and get over just the offering. How can what you've learned through the Arizona Storytellers and as an awarded journalist that you can share with our audience about that? So right after this. Are you keeping track of sales leads in a spreadsheet, or worse, Post-it notes all over your desk? Well, there's a better way, and it doesn't involve spending a fortune on complex CRM software. For over 25 years, ACT has been the #1 best-selling contact and customer management software. It's super affordable and easy to use. ACT helps individuals, small businesses, and sales teams organize prospect and customer details in just one place. It also helps you market products and services more effectively, and most importantly, it drives sales. Try ACT for 30 days by visiting actstory.com and sign up for a chance to win a pair of Bose Quiet Comfort 20i acoustic noise canceling headphones, a $299 value. Again, that's actstory.com. Welcome back to the Business of Story, and our guest today, Megan Finnerty with the Arizona Republic, a Gannett newspaper, and the founder and mastermind behind Arizona Storytelling Project, which is now going national in a lot of different ways. So that's very cool. So, Megan, you have a story you want to share with us, or your approach to it?
Yeah, so I want to talk about, also people are usually like, well, but what do you really do? And so one of the things we're working with other Gannett markets, including Indianapolis, Cincinnati, if you live in any of these places, go to the nights, they're going to be great. Palm Springs, Fort Collins, Lansing, we are training them to train people. So their whole deal is we believe that a lot of public speaking opportunities get used up by individuals who are charismatic or outgoing or professionally trained. Perhaps they're big in speech and debate, or they're actors and actresses, or they're fancy business people who get a lot of private coaching, or they're, Toastmasters. And what we feel like our real value to our communities is, since we train you on how to tell a compelling story, we create a space for a diversity of voices, for all kinds of identities and narratives to be shared, and all kinds of people to tell their stories. And so that means that we get a lot of stuff that just comes in the doors, and people are always like, oh my God, how do you turn people down? And I'm actually like, I don't. If you get on the phone with me, by the time you get on the phone with me, if you've gone through a very basic vetting process, which is just kind of email me your story, and then I look to see if you're a nut job or trying to, whatever, run for political office, which is totally inappropriate.
Is that why you keep declining my stories?
No, seriously, okay. Park. But by the time you get on the phone with me, you probably have like a 97% chance of telling live. You would sort of self-select out based on feedback or other things that happen. And so I kind of wanted to share with you, what does the process look like? Or
Perfect.
What's it like? So, first we send them an email and we say, like, here's the parts of a good story, and all of that's boilerplate. And you can even Google these kinds of things, or you can obviously, come to me and I'll help you. Or you come to someone like Park and you go to his classes. And then you have to send a pitch with your 10 sentences. And again, I'm just looking to be like, hey, are you denying the Holocaust? Or are you trying to run for political office? Or are you trying to just say bad stuff about your ex-wife? Like, all of those things would get you, I don't call you back. But then when you call, you just tell me your story. And that usually takes a little time. And what I'm always listening for is, are you self-aware enough to articulate what you learned? Because stories document change, and you have to learn something to change. And like, if you're just like, no, I just want to describe a thing, then I always remind people that's an anecdote, and you need to keep that in your pocket so you can stay married or keep dating, because that's what people talk about at dinner. But that's not what we share with strangers. And then I'm always listening for whether or not they're far away enough from the thing that happened to be able to emotionally tell it safely. Which is not something journalists usually think about. Journalists are like, I don't know, tell me what's going on. The more, like, we interview you 5 minutes after your dad was hit by a car. Like, that's our job.
So give us an example.
So this woman called me and she said, I want to tell a story about your life and death night. I see it's coming up in a couple months. And I was like, ooh, thanks for being so prepared. And she says, I'm a mom and I gave birth to twins, and one of them died and one of them lived. So I was really like, ooh, because I'm a twin, and obviously we're both here. But I was really, really interested. But then I was like also really compassionate, because this is a stranger and she doesn't know me, and she's being very vulnerable right from the start. This is some strange woman in Phoenix just calling this lady journalist. So I say, well, just tell me what happened. And she does. It's very chronological. It's very straightforward. It sounds like all the birth and delivery stories you've heard, only it has this sort of very sad ending. And she gets done and I'm quiet. And I ask the first question I ask everybody, which is, what does that mean to you? What do you think you know today that I could never know because I didn't experience this thing? And that's usually a very fruitful question to ask someone, regardless of why they're telling a story or what the story's topic is. What do you know because you experienced this that others who haven't can't know? It also honors them. It also says you have specific knowledge that's valuable and worth sharing, and that I perhaps would never want to live through that, but you could tell me what you learned. Like, that's a very wonderful thing to say to someone, regardless of what the experience was, good or bad. And at first she said, well, God doesn't give you more than you can handle. And I was like, so I'm really nice, so I'm just going to condense. Basically, I was like, no, that's not true. Lots of people commit suicide. Lots of people live lives addicted to drug and painkillers or other types of terrible things because they can't cope with the realities of their existence. Because, like, God doesn't check in with you first. Like, your life is your life, and certainly many of us are burdened with things we cannot handle. So that doesn't work. And she was like, okay, I'll call you back and I'll keep thinking on this. So she calls me back like a month later, a couple weeks later. And she says, okay, the lesson I have from this story is everything happens for a reason. And I was like, oh, no, that's not going to work either. I have a twin. My life is way better because she's existing. Please don't tell me that your life would be, like, your life would be better if your baby were here. Like, let's honor that. Let's just say that that's true. And, I'm not trying to get her to cry, and I'm not trying to, like, be hard on her. I'm just like, lady, a terrible thing happened to you. Let's honor that. Like, don't sell me some Hallmark thing. And she wasn't trying to. She said, she feels all this pressure from our culture to, like, make it okay. And I said, well, the Arizona Storytellers Project doesn't need to make anything okay. We just you want to tell this story, and I want to try to create a space that's safe for you to tell it, and that's safe for audiences to hear it. Because you're not the only person this has ever happened to. And even if somebody didn't give birth and one lived and one died, many of us have had losses that feel meaningless. So then she calls me back again and she says, all right, I'm gonna tell you. I'm a doomsday prepper. And my husband and I have like a bomb shelter, and we have 3 years worth of canned goods or whatever it is. And she was like, I could, and this is as close a quote as I can honor her with. She goes, listen, I can plant wheat, I can grow it, I can thresh it, I can mill it, and I can bake it into bread in an oven, a solar oven I built myself. I was like, damn, Gina. And so she said, what I learned from this is you can't prepare to bring one baby home and to bury another. You can't prepare for a phone call where someone will offer you congratulations and condolences in the same call. You cannot prepare to arrange for a funeral and a baptism. you cannot prepare. And if you could buy a book to teach you how to prepare for it, I would have bought the book. And if I felt like I could write it and it would be used to anyone, I would have written it. But you can't. And my husband and I have had to learn that there is no preparing for like what it will mean to bring a child into the world, because all of the risks you'll have. And I was like, oh God, so what are you left with? And she said, well, I'm pregnant with another child, and we've just accepted that you can't prepare for everything, but you have to be open to it, and you can't stop living your life. Wow. And I was like, well, that's it, right?
Yeah, that's powerful.
It is, and it's a cliche too, though. Like the others were cliches, right? And that's a cliche too, right? Like you can't prepare for everything. You can just go, like you never know what tomorrow is promised, and like things happen, blah, blah. And so it wasn't that I was trying to get her to share some uncovered truth that no one else knows, because that's actually meaningless. Actually, we only want universal truths. It's that she shared it in such a specific way that being prepared meant a lot to her. And maybe if being prepared isn't a lot, maybe if you're a fly by your seat of your pants person, you would have accepted your child's death really like, well, things happen, and we are not promised all the things that occur, right? Like we're promised nothing. But because she had tried so hard to be so ready for all the possible eventualities, and God forbid, I'm like crossing myself. There's like, who would prepare for that? That's a terrible thing to prepare for. And she learned you can't. And I was like, that's just incredible. But one of the things we also did was I said to her the day of, she walked in and I said, if at any moment you don't want to tell this story, even if the moment you walk in with your husband and you look at this audience and you order a glass of wine or whatever, order dinner and you think, okay, I thought I wanted to do this and I don't. I told her she could back out literally at any moment, because it's such a big story and it's such a heavy lift emotionally. And she didn't. She told the story. It was amazing. It was wonderful. I'm really proud of that. But we've had lots and lots and lots of stories like that. And so that's kind of like when people say, like, what do you do? Or what does coaching matter? Like, I'm like, that's the difference. She always had the story and she always knew what it meant to her. But the reason you work with a coach is because it's hard to be articulate about this stuff. Like, no one writes a memoir in one draft, right? There's a reason why you have editors. And the thing about storytelling is people think you're born charismatic or you're a born storyteller. And I think some storytellers like that because they think it makes them look good. And I'm always like, no, gosh, you're no more a born storyteller than you're born a great writer. And anybody who says writing is easy is a liar. And anyone who's good at it says it's a great deal of labor. Yeah. And so I think that's like what storytellers can do most in service of each other, is actually like own the work. And don't be shy about it, and be like, yeah, it's a ton of work. You should pay someone to help you with it.
Well, and I think, Megan, that we are natural storytellers, but it gets silenced in us. And I often tell my audiences, my workshop groups, that we were at the tops of our games in kindergarten. But then as we go through school and we go through corporate culture and political correctness and all the guardrails and like you said here, I really liked your line about culture has to make everything okay. That let's avoid the conflict. Don't worry about the conflict. We can skirt around that somehow, and it's not going to be a big deal. And it's not. You've got to have conflict within these stories. That I think it's great with what you're doing, because you are teaching people how to find that inner storyteller again and reignite that in them again. Another guest of ours, Lisa Cron, who wrote Wired for Story, a fantastic book. She, in there, I will swipe her thought about storytelling being a superpower. She mentioned it in a TED Talk, and I really believe that, because it's the one thing we can do as people. When you're really good, you can literally move strangers to action. You can persuade them to do things. So do it, use it for good, not evil. And that idea of sharing a universal truth, but in a very specific way, because isn't the bottom line with every story is we're trying to learn something? We want to know what the hero, what the storyteller, what we would do if we were in their shoes and if it happens to us.
One of the things, though, that I struggle with, or that I feel like I'm deprogramming from people, though, is that there's other ideas in our culture that says, well, everyone has a story and you should tell it. And my response to that is like, yeah, you might, but not every audience wants to hear the story you think you want to tell. Like, that's basically your mom and your therapist. So cool. And when I talk to groups, I always lead with like, you don't want to be the hero of your own story, that only veterans and my dad get to do that. And my dad is a veteran, but he actually never talks about Vietnam. But I'm always like, listen, every story my dad tells is about like, he's great. He solves all the problems. He's really good looking. He's really smart. He's a great dresser. He's just the world's most charismatic, competent man. And you know what? I love hearing those stories about my dad. Obviously, like you can hear him smiling when I talk. But I'm the audience for that. I'm his children at the dinner table. But when we talk about ourselves, a lot of times people feel like they want to come to me and they always say, well, I want to tell this story because I want to inspire people. Or frankly, they want to tell the story because they want to, quote unquote, I want to raise awareness. And I was like, you don't need to raise awareness that people are terrible to other people and tell me about the worst thing that ever happened to you. Or people are like, I want to talk about how I overcame my divorce and I want to inspire other women to be strong. Because I think, and I love Oprah, but I think like talk shows and Oprah and a lot of other mediums have encouraged people to what I would describe as like vomit up all their stuff on strangers. And then I have to deal with your narrative. And it's kind of like, well, no, actually, that's a really reckless and unsafe thing to do. And then you're just burdening strangers with your stuff. And people, like, they come to me all the time with like this stuff. And I'm like, okay. And my first question is, but how can you share that in a way that it can be received by a diverse audience in the spirit in which it was intended? Because most people, when you push back on them and say, but like, why are you telling me this? Well, they're not going to admit that they want to just like talk about themselves and get themselves validated for their trauma. That could be true. And one of the things we do with the Arizona Storytellers Project is we're really militant or vigilant about saying like, we are not a place to develop catharsis. You have to come to us with catharsis because we're not trained to be storytellers for healing. There are programs for that and they're run out of like mental health or recovery programs. We're not storytelling for healing. We're not any of that. And that's important for people to know because if you come looking for that kind of self-development, I don't have the safeguards in place or the professional competency to ensure you get it. And so that would be really unsafe. And so one of the things that we're always sort of talking about is our North Stars are, like I said, emotional safety for the teller and emotional safety for the audience. And so if someone would get up there and just be like, all this horrible stuff happened to me and like it's important for people to hear my story, I'm kind of like, no, it might be important for you. And that's great. And you should find an appropriate audience for it. But the general public is like actually probably not often the appropriate audience for it. Because then that's just like them having to take on your trauma. And traditional storytellers operate in a totally different way. They feel like all stories, and by traditional I mean people who often are carriers of religious tales, folk tales, how-to stories, like or how-so stories, those kinds of things. When you think kind of like those kinds of storytelling, their stories all have to be in service of the community and never rarely in service of the teller. And so I think that's this thing that sort of is being teased out in sort of modern storytelling in America is this guardedness that really great organizations, and the Moth does do this, and other people do, where they say, you can't just get up there and like unload on people. And I think the way we keep that from happening is we compel our tellers to say what's in this for the listener and bake that into the narrative from the beginning. And also that it has to be entertaining. Because if your story is just kind of like, and sometimes people call them, they like tell recovery stories. And I'm totally like validating that. It's really, really, really important. But there is an audience for a straight recovery story that is just like, and you recovered and that's good. Yeah. And that audience, and it might be within the context of a recovery organization or people who are supporters of that organization. But if you want to tell a straight recovery narrative on one of our nights, I'm probably going to need to work with you to make sure the story has enough layers to it so that people who are not currently in recovery or don't interact with that world can also hear something that's meaningful to them.
So we live in this world of brand storytelling and business storytelling, especially in the B2B world, professional services firms. What can our listeners learn from everything you have taken out from being a journalist, a cross-platform story developer, and story artist, really?
Story artist.
You are a superb presenter, because I've seen you in action and MC for the program. But what can business people get from this? And can a brand truly humanize itself through story?
I hope they can. I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think all great leaders need a pocket full of stories. And, if you work with me or you can work with lots of people, those narratives are probably not surprising. But, you need a really great mentorship narrative so that the people in your company value lifting each other up. That could be totally snipey and competitive with each other. So you need to be able to tell a story as a leader about a time someone lifted you up. 2, all brands need a story that's like why we do what we do. Now, most brands have a really great elevator pitch for this, and they could tell you like in a big doc, they have like value statements, yada, yada, yada. But most people actually are not great at articulating the why they do what they do. I heard a woman the other day. She was amazing. She runs a healthcare communications business. So it's really dry, really dry. It's kind of PR. It's really B2B. And it's like she works with pharmacies to her job is to work with drug development companies and doctors.
And isn't that ironic that healthcare, in the same term you said healthcare in a very dry business, when you're treating people?
Exactly,
and yet
right?
It's so dry. It's just
so
irony.
When you ask her, like, why do you actually work in this kind of wonky little corner of the universe? She had an amazing story. And she said, well, when I was 16, basically her mother had a mole on her ear. The doctor in their very small town in Britain didn't know what the signs were of brain cancer. And then when it was growing and metastasizing, long story short, her mother died of brain cancer. And she said, if that doctor had been better informed and was up to date on research on moles and skin cancer and brain cancer, skin cancer, quote unquote, on your head, she's like, my mom might have lived longer or lived without as much pain or whatever. And she goes, so I understand firsthand the consequences of bad medical communication between drug development and researchers and day-to-day family doctors. And I want to be part of the solution.
And that's her mission then.
Right. And now
Amazing.
and she told it a little bit longer than that.
Yeah.
And she also did a thing. She interrupted herself in the middle of the story and said, listen, that happened when I was 16. I'm much, much older now. I'm fine with this. Obviously, I'm okay with my mother's death, which is a competency thing. So anyway, everybody needs a great story. And not everyone is going to have a story quite like that involves family and death. But most great companies have a great story about why they exist. Then underneath your third story you need the people who work for you to have their own connection to that narrative. Then you need what's the difference we made for our client's story. That could be that other story, that connection they have individually, but it's here's the difference we make for our clients. Another great story your brand needs is usually an overcoming hardship story. The other day I was speaking at an architecture conference and I joked with all these architects. I was like, if you're in business in Arizona in 2015, you probably have a story about how 2008 to 2010 were the lean years and you barely made it out. Or maybe you didn't make it out and you're reinventing yourself. I was like, that's a story you need to be able to tell to inspire your team when the chips are down, or to show that you made it through. That's a powerful narrative. That's not just a crappy thing that happened to you. That's a great story to tell. And then what I like to call every great brand needs a cocktail party story. And this is my favorite because I like to drink. I'm kidding, whatever. But basically, it's a story that you can use that's about 3 minutes long, that illuminates some meaningful idea about what you do for a living, but also tells you a little bit about yourself. And I find that most business people are actually super terrible at this. They know how to ask for money in a direct pitch. They love themselves some PowerPoints and some how-to talks. They're really good at just blah, blah, blah about blah, oh, my dad's in the steel mill industry. I really could tell you a lot about how steel is made. But most people don't get into their jobs because they just love widget making. They get into their jobs because they feel some emotional connection to the reality or the truth of the underlying business, right? Well, you can learn how to tell that in a clever way over drinks, which is not ever asking anyone for money or anything. And I always am explaining to people this is really great because when you're going to conferences or something, you always need to kill time at drinks, right? And no one wants to be pitched. That's actually super, super tacky. Oh my God, if I were standing around with you at a cocktail party and you were pitching me on how great you are, I'd be like, what a jerk. Can't we just chat like humans? Be charming, flirt with me a little. God, we got 20 minutes to kill before dinner. And then if you share compellingly for a couple minutes, and I always point out, people will let you talk, especially if they have drinks in your hands, and even longer if you're really good looking. You do you. I don't know if you're good looking or not, but you'll have a sense of that, I'm sure. Then what will happen is the people that you're standing around with, you will literally inspire a tiny story in them. And then you can just stand around for the next 20 minutes. And when everyone thinks back on that stupid cocktail party, they'll be like, oh man, that guy was so charming. But really, you only talked for 3 minutes entirely about yourself. You just started them then on the rest of the way. And then it's all easy breezy for you. Then you're just standing around getting a refill. And people, I think, actually get really nervous about those moments. And they think oh, well, how do I talk about myself without sounding like a jerk? And I'm like, well, actually, you can hire a storytelling coach to help you do this. There are some real do's and don'ts. Actually, one, don't brag. No one likes weird braggy people. Don't. And I always mention this to business people. I'm like, don't talk about sex unless your business is about sex. And people are like, why would I? I'm like, I don't know. But if it weren't a problem, do you think I would be saying it? I'm also, I don't know. People do that about business sometimes. They work it in. And I'm like, not cool, dude. Not cool. So anyway, those are the 5 little stories I think most business owners need in their pocket, and they can certainly hire communications consultants to help them. They might already have their own in-house talent. And knowing that you need these narratives is definitely half the battle. And then I gave you 2 don'ts right there. Don't brag and don't talk about sex. And then you might be asking, well, how do I talk about how good I am at my job without bragging? But that's what Park mentioned earlier is conflict. Don't be the person that solves the problem yourself. And I always use Lord of the Rings as my example, right? The quote-unquote hero of the story is Frodo. But Frodo's a basket case. He just keeps putting on that ring, and then he like gets drunk on power and has hallucinations, and he's always trying to get kidnapped by those weird things that fly in the sky. I'm sure nerds are listening to this, and people who love Lord of the Rings are like, here's what they're called. But Samwise is really the hero. Samwise is always protecting him, looking out for him, taking the ring off, and like carrying it in a little pouch around his neck because it's too much for Frodo. And like you always need the Samwise to come into your story, and people underestimate the Samwises in their life. But the Samwise is like the linchpin of great storytelling. And so anyway, that's basically what I tell business people all the time is like, you need a couple stories, and you usually can ask people for help developing them, and just like know your Samwise.
Awesome. Fantastic. Let's take one more break for our wonderful sponsors, and when we come back, we'll put a big bow on this. And in doing so, can you offer us 2 or 3 or 4 tips that every storyteller should know when crafting a story?
Totally.
Right back with Megan Finnerty. Did you know that on average, each of us sends around 10,000 emails each year? And what does each message include? Well, an email signature, right? Well, Angie's List realized the reach they had with their 270 employees and decided to use their email signatures to promote their flagship customer event called the Festival of Services. Angie's List dialed up Sigster to become mission control for its email signature campaign. In minutes, each employee had a Sigster-powered call to action in their email signature. In 6 months, the campaign had been viewed more than 2 million times, resulting in 4,500 visits to the registration portal, or 38% of all visits, which meant Sigster drove more engagement than any other tracked marketing activity. Now, if you want to ignite the most ubiquitous and overlooked promotional channel in your business from one simple platform, visit Sigster.com. That's SIGSTR.com. And see how they will help you message, measure, and manage your email signature marketing. Hey, if it's good enough for Angie, it's good enough for me. Your customers, employees, marketing campaigns, partners, and yes, your detractors, they're each telling a story right now about you. Where? On social media, in traditional print publications, in blog posts, on television, basically everywhere. And it's happening 24/7, in real time. Your mission? Track these stories and the sources that share them, smartly manage them, analyze them rapidly, and discern what you should do next, what you should do now. No wonder you're tired. Well, Signal Labs is a real-time, cross-media story tracking platform that makes your life easier. Their solution enables customers to quickly spot trends, see relevant stories unfold, and take action. So stay ahead of what the world thinks with Signal Labs. Learn more and sign up for a free demo at signallabs.com/story. Good stuff. I never heard of the Samwise. Samwise?
You know who he is? He's the Sean Astin guy.
Yeah, but is that what they call him? Samwise?
I think that's his name.
Samwise.
Oh, God, Samwise Gamgee.
I haven't watched Lord of the Rings since our kids were little. I got to watch that again. But you're so right. I'd never thought about that connection before.
Well, no, and I also use Lord of the Rings. Here's why I use Lord of the Rings. First of all, it's non-religious, and it's not really even cultural. Like, basically, if you're talking to Westerners, they've probably seen Lord of the Rings. And it works on so many levels because you could also say, like, okay, Lord of the Rings is 3 books. It's a 9.5-hour trilogy if you watch it, you know. And it has a million themes. And people understand those themes. Good and evil, friendship, loyalty, the little guy versus the big guy, building coalitions to take on something powerful. Like, there's a lot of themes, let alone the political themes of, like, nation-state building and whatever, which I don't get into because that's not my thing. But I always use that as an example to say the stories that you would bring to me for storytellers, I can't accommodate Lord of the Rings, but I can accommodate a scene. And every scene has a point. Every scene is a tiny story. So think of your favorite scene, and then, like, now think of your life like that. or whatever. Like, I just like to use an example also because, listen, everyone knows Frodo is the hero. And then he goes on a journey, and then he's helped by friends. And so I always like to point out, but like Frodo actually never solves his own problems. Frodo is actually a basket case. And he's not maybe a basket case because he's a loser. He's a basket case because that ring is killing him. And so it's useful to be able to say like, okay, but who's the Samwise in your life or who's the Gandalf in your life? And they all play really different parts. So anyway, I just find it to be totally an easy and super lazy way to describe storytelling to lay people. And also, I'm not that sophisticated, right? Like, if I were more sophisticated, maybe I'd be talking about Greek mythology.
I love it.
Like,
no, it's great. I'm the same way, too. They get into Shakespeare and all that stuff, and I'm just like, that's too deep for me. I need to get back to...
Well, and you can talk to high schoolers about this.
Yeah, and they're going to connect.
Also, the other day, I was talking to people, and I was trying to use Harry Potter, and I was like, I met kids who didn't read Harry Potter, and I was like... What will we have in common as a culture?
Exactly.
I was like,
no
you
Harry
people.
Potter.
Yeah. So, I use Lord of the Rings a lot as an analogy.
Well, folks, as you can tell, we're back from the break, and we just had a wonderful overview from Megan about Lord of the Rings and how she uses it. So we're going to continue on. If that seemed like an awkward return, that's just the way we roll around here at Business of Story. Nicely done. But now I've got to go back and watch it again because I haven't watched it since my kids were little.
It holds up.
It's amazing.
Yeah, they're great.
Except some of those creatures just freak the hell out of me. I mean, I'm just sorry. Some
Watch
of them
it during the
just
day.
Like, So, wrapping up the show here, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 things that every storyteller, I mean, the simple things that we could do right now to make a story better? Okay,
get out your pen. Like, for real.
Okay.
Because this is just free stuff. I'm just giving this away. This is super, super practical. Boom, right? So you already know stories. So I like to think, first of all, as storytelling for a purpose is totally like cooking. All meals are served to certain people at certain times for certain reasons. And that's how you need to use a story in your life, especially if you're a business person. You don't develop one narrative and just tell it to everybody. That would be like saying, I know how to cook hamburgers, and then that's all you ever get when you come to my house, which would be great for Popeye, but that is not great for real humans, right? So you need to think of your story as that. Now, you might be then thinking, oh my God, but I have a million stories and that's really overwhelming. Well, you're right. So you need to think of your memory as a grocery store. Grocery stores are big and overwhelming, and you do not go to them when you're hungry, because then you just end up eating Doritos in the hallway. So instead, you need to think, wait, I'm going to go there with a list and a recipe, maybe a list of ingredients and a recipe of what I will do with them. And you also go in with an idea of like, for what occasion am I cooking and who will be there? Well, that is exactly how you need to think about storytelling. So great, right? You already know how to make a dinner for people or lunch, and now that's how you're going to make a story. So what we're going to talk about now is going to be your recipe book and your ingredient list. So first, ingredients. It's not going to be hard. People, place, problem, which is also conflict, progress, which other people would call falling action or, whatever, like working through. And then the point, which is the conclusion. Now, the 5 Ps come from a genius storyteller named Donald Davis. He is a hero. He is amazing. I am using his name here because I did not develop the 5 Ps, and he's the best. So,
who is Donald Davis? Where can we find out about him? You
can find out Donald Davis by Googling him. He tells all the time at the Jonesboro Storytelling Festival. He lives out on Ocracoke Island on the Atlantic coast, and he is a traditional storyteller. He works with big brands and helps them develop their stories. But people basically, Donald will tell to a room of 40,000 people in one room. Donald is a legend and an incredibly kind man. But Google him. He's just a total master storyteller. So anyway, he came up with the 5 Ps. So that's your ingredient list.
People, place, problem or conflict, progress, and then point.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So those are your ingredients. Because sometimes people just start in, and I'm all I can picture you is floating in space because there's no place in your story. I need a time, I need a region.
You need a setting.
Yeah.
A backstory.
That's right. Yeah. Where are we? We're in my locker room. It's 1994. We're at Michigan City High School. It's a middle class high school in a small town in Indiana. Okay, great. Now I don't need to keep going because whatever. You went to high school. You know what lockers look like. We're done. You don't have to kill yourself here with this. Okay. Now we need a recipe book. So we're going to give you some do's and don'ts. Don't brag. Okay, we talked about that. It means don't just talk about how great you are. Don't, like I said, talk about sex because it's weird. This is, again, storytelling for probably first-time interactions or big groups where you don't know everybody. It would be very, very different if you're telling to a small audience of people you know or whatever. don't usually talk about a time someone was terrible to you. The reason I say that is because it creates an emotional imbalance with the audience, and they're gonna want to know, should they pity you? Should they protect you? Should they help you? It also could make you look pathetic or sad, which are just not cool things to do if you don't know people. Now, if you're a good storyteller, you obviously could figure out how to do this. This is sort of really rudimentary. 3 or 4, don't talk about a time you got angry. Again, if your origin story is you're solving a problem that made you mad, you just kind of have to make it clear to the people that you're not always angry. Because if I've never met you before and the first story you tell me is about a time you got really angry, I might be like, well, maybe you're not cool to work with because you're kind of like an angry dude or like an angry lady. And again, that's even more problematic for women because people hate when women show anger. So you really got to do the math on your identity and the identity of your listener and your gender role, blah, blah, blah. This is stuff you got to think about. But that's okay. If your business is a solution to something that was negative or made you angry, the way you can talk about that is by doing what that woman who I mentioned earlier where her mother died. She kind of interrupted her story to let the audience know that she was emotionally healthy and safe and that she's not always experiencing loss. So you could do that. You could be like, actually, the crazy thing is I'm almost never angry. That's why this stood out to me so much. And I knew I had to solve the problem with my business idea or my product. So you can clean up that pretty easily, but you got to think to do it. Also, those are most of my don'ts. It's not a big list, but then there's some really big do's. Use visual words because people are making a movie in their head. That's it. This is not rocket science. Especially if you're a visual person or an architect or a designer or a creative person, really draw on your 5 senses. That's how people experience the world. That's how you need to tell a story. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're talking about something. You're not telling me what happened.
So it's the old show, don't tell.
Show, don't tell, buddy. Show, don't tell. Yeah.
And you learn that in Journalism 101.
Yeah. And then, I usually even interrupt people sometimes or I'll let them kind of get it off their chest. And then I say, that's great, but you just told me about something that happened. You didn't tell me something that happened. So start over. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? And I was like, and then I literally say this, and you can do this with yourself. Once upon a time, this thing happened. And you literally just start that way because sometimes it's just we're so self-conscious or we're so in our own heads. I really do say once upon a time. And then people laugh, but they actually then start telling the story. So the other thing you want to do is be vulnerable. And that's really hard. But vulnerability, especially if I'm not going to be crass here, especially if you're in sales or you're trying to get somebody to buy into you or buy into a product. Vulnerability is like the emotional shortcut. It's the shortcut to empathy. And empathy is what makes us want to be with others or participate in what they're doing, or it's the bonding feeling, And so vulnerability doesn't have to be too much. It can be just admitting to the conflict, or it could be admitting to the part of the story where you had to get help. It could be the part of the story where you admit you didn't know how to solve your own problem, or that a bad thing did kind of happen to you and it wasn't totally within your control and you needed to get help fixing it. The very first story I told on our very first Storytellers Night was about a boy who didn't want to date me. Story of my life. But, I end up, it's fine. We stay friends. No one dies. It's fine. I'm 14. But for this little moment, you are cringing for me because I was really vulnerable and I told him I wanted to date him and I told him I wanted to be his girlfriend. And oh God, can you just imagine with my perm and my baby fat and I'm 14? That's vulnerability. I'm just basically telling you, this dude didn't want me. Well, that's not the most flattering story I could tell a group of strangers about myself, but it's also pretty low risk. Okay, I'm 14, I'm fine. So vulnerability is important. And then knowing what your value is that you really want the audience to understand. Most stories can't contain 100 values or ideas. That would be a long story. Most of the time, we're only going to talk about ourselves for maybe 3 to 5 minutes tops. Again, that's if you're pretty compelling and you've worked hard. And
this is the moral of the story, and every story has a moral to it.
Well, and your story can have 2 tracks. The one thing I like to always help business owners with is what they really want is somebody's going to ask you a question most of the time, and that's going to be your lead for the story. And they might say, well, how did you get into this? Or they might say, I don't know anything about, that kind of work. Just tell me about it. So on the very basic level, your story needs to accomplish what they've literally asked you to do, which is explain to them what is the thing you do or how did you come to be this thing that you are. Those are usually the most common questions we ask strangers about their jobs or about the business they're in. But that's the very basic building block. That's the narrative probably your story needs, that's the shape the story needs to take. But then what's the point of the story. Now that point is going to change depending on your audience, right? So like if you sell a certain product, you might have a point to one audience, but if you want to sell that same product to a different audience, your story might have a slightly different point. And it might even be the same narrative, you're just emphasizing a different element of it. So, whenever people say, how did you become a journalist? It's not rocket science. I went to college, I went to high school, I went to college, I got internships, I got hired at the Arizona Republic, I've worked hard. Okay, well, that's the shape of the story. But depending on my audience or what I think I want to really deeply communicate, I can emphasize different aspects of my career or of my mentorship or of who's helped me along the way. That story can have a lot of different points. Mm-hmm. So that's it. Those are your do's and don'ts.
That's it. And then everyone can be an expert storyteller just on that.
The last one.
Practice.
Exactly.
Yes.
I was going to say, tell your story in front of other people and get feedback. And that's our biggest message is we want to demystify storytelling, and we don't want you to feel like it's this thing someone else can do. Mm-hmm. Park, you mentioned 100 people that a lot of people who tell us we are innate storytellers and we have stories inside of us. And what I want people to know though is that they do, and it's not their fault. They're not great storytellers, mm-hmm. right? It's because people who are great storytellers, by the time you're seeing them on YouTube or you're going to see them at an event or you've paid a ticket to watch them speak, they've done a lot of homework. And it would be like holding yourself accountable and being like, oh, well, I know how to write. Why can't I write like John Updike? Well, John Updike was a great writer and spent a lot of his life writing. Mm-hmm. So even though you can tell a great story, it's helpful to practice because you will get better. The 15th time or the 10th time you tell or the 5th time you tell will be better than the first.
So Megan, where can people learn about the Arizona Storyteller Project and if one is coming to their neighborhood?
Oh man, that's great. No, I'm kidding. I was going to say Google. So if you go to storytellers.azcentral.com, that's where you can find about us. If you want to participate in an upcoming night or just attend one, you can go to tickets.azcentral.com. We literally have tickets available through November of 2016. We're booked with venues for the next year. We're doing 18 nights here in the greater Phoenix area. And if you want to find out about the markets that are coming to you, I don't actually have a list of that. We're in the middle. We're building our national website right now. But you can Google that, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a great article on azcentral.com about it.
Yes, mm-hmm. Yeah, we've written about it. And I'm the most Googleable person in the world. If you want to get in touch with me, you can go to meganmfinnerty.com, Finnerty. And I'll email you back. I'm a very responsible person.
And by the way, Megan has an amazing email newsletter. Does that come out once a month or is it every couple of weeks?
It's supposed to be weekly, but people's lives are busy. You don't want to read me every week. I can't put it out every week. So it's every week or two.
Yeah, but it's so much fun. Your writing style is fantastic. It's the same personality you're hearing right here, but you also have a lot of really odd sort of stories and insights within that newsletter. So,
I wouldn't like to use the word odd.
Well, I liked it because they're so different. So to me, they're odd. They're not what you would typically expect from a newsletter.
It's a mix of so it's things to feel, drink, and do because I have a lot of feelings. I like cocktails and I like inviting people to do things. And so it's a mix of sort of hair and beauty recommendations, great stories from all over the journalism world that I think are compelling. I'm not very controversial. I never talk about politics. Yeah. It's a little bit of my personality. But it's also just hey, here's a great piece in the New York Times about about raising kids, because I'll be like, oh, that seems interesting to me. I don't know.
Here's why I like it. When I was a little kid growing up in Seattle, downtown, it's still there on the waterfront, the greatest tourist trap ever called the Ye Olde Curiosity Shop. And you go into the Ye Olde Curiosity Shop, and they have a mummy in there. Mm-hmm. They have, I know we're not supposed to talk about sex, but they have a penis from a gray whale in there.
I would definitely want to look at that.
Yeah, they have the shrunken heads. It's awesome. And what I like about your newsletter is it's kind of a Ye Olde Curiosity Shop in kind of a strange way for me, but really, really worth the subscription anyway.
Yeah, you can sign up at my little website. It's also super Googleable. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and it's absolutely free.
It's totally free. And I never sell you anything. It's important to mention. There's no sponsorships there. It's not weird. I'm always super, super transparent. Yeah. I will also say when you deal with journalists, we're super, super transparent. Mm-hmm. We never really are working angles. And in whatever we are working, we just tell you, here's my deal. In fact, I put out one and I said, today's newsletter is brought to you by Southwest Wi-Fi. And my editor read it and was like, you need to clarify in your next newsletter that you are not actually sponsored by Southwest, but that you were just using their Wi-Fi on a plane when you were putting it out. And I was like, And then I was just like, you're right. People are very literal. Yeah. I will put that in my, so.
Yeah. Well, Megan, thank you for being on Business of Story. We appreciate having you here in our glamorous Universal offices here at 44th Street and Indian School Road in Phoenix, Arizona. And I hope you'll come back and be a guest another time soon.
I hope that you come and you tell on one of our nights.
I'm going
That
to.
would be really great.
I've been thinking of stories this whole time,
goodness.
so I'll figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This has been such an exciting opportunity and a total blessing, and I hope that people got something tiny out of it.
Oh, I think they got something major, so thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of Business of Story. If you like what you're hearing, please go to iTunes and give us your thoughts and your rankings. We love that. Share it with your friends, family, and peeps out there. I have a number of storytelling tools free that you can download at businessofstory.com. And this has now been about 6 months into the creation of this podcast, so we have a ton of great, fabulous content and other guests in our archives that you can listen to again at businessofstory.com. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Park Howell, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for tuning in to The Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Oracle Marketing Cloud, Park & Co., Sixter, Zignal Labs, and ACT, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts.